This is the story of a young woman in her 30s, a desperate vendor whose life on the streets of Lagos was driven by survival, ambition, and an unexplainable secret. She had no family to lean on, no safety net, only her battered cart and the magical beans she prepared that had earned the admiration of everyone in her neighborhood. But behind the laughter of satisfied customers and the rich aroma of her famous beans, a hidden covenant haunted her every move, a promise that if ever broken, would bring unimaginable consequences. In this folktale, we witness how desperation can lead to deals with forces beyond understanding, how talent can be intertwined with danger, and how a single moment of pressure can unravel a carefully maintained life. The story explores the price of success, the power of unseen promises, and the terrifying reality that some indulgences carry consequences too deadly to imagine. Her journey is one of hunger, restraint, and inevitable reckoning, a tale that mixes suspense, mystery, and folklore into a narrative that will grip you from the very first ladle to the final chilling moment. This is the story of the woman whose beans everyone loved, but she never tasted herself. Welcome to Afritales by SophyJay, the home of storytelling. Don't forget to subscribe, comment, like, and share this story to support Afritales by SophyJay. Join the community for more thrilling African folktales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Morning light barely kissed the streets when Anita appeared, dragging a battered wooden cart behind her, the familiar scrape of its wheels announcing her arrival before anyone could even see her. The air was thick with the scent of the city waking, the smell of wet asphalt, frying fuel, and distant smoke mixing into an invisible haze that clung to clothes and hair. She moved with practiced precision, lifting a large blackened pot from the back of the cart, brushing her fingers against the rough handles, feeling the slight warmth already seeping from the beans she had left cooking overnight. The aroma rose in a cloud, rich and earthy, mingling with a faint sweetness that hinted at secret spices carefully folded into each batch. By the time the first passerby caught a glimpse, the line had already begun, shadows stretching across the pavement as mouths watered before a single taste had passed their lips. Her name was whispered among early commuters and bus drivers, among students who barely had enough coins to pay for one meal. The beans, they said, the woman's beans are the best in town, and even before anyone took their first bite, they knew she had something no other street vendor could replicate. She arranged small metal bowls on a fraying cloth spread over the cart, stacking them meticulously to avoid toppling, while stirring the beans in slow circular motions. Each stir released a puff of steam that carried aromas so deep, so layered, that anyone who inhaled felt their stomach growl involuntarily. There was no signage, no advertising beyond the scent wafting through the street, and yet by mid-morning, the line stretched further than she had expected, twisting around corners, around streetlights, around the edge of the bus stop. Drivers abandoned their vehicles for a few moments, balancing bowls on knees as they tasted a spoonful, closing eyes, savoring the flavors, muttering in disbelief. One boy, no more than 15, smiled with a flush of excitement, holding his portion carefully, whispering to his friend, "It tastes like home, like something I've never had but always remembered." She watched silently, her dark eyes tracking each person's reaction, her expression calm, almost unreadable. A faint shadow crossed her face when someone offered her a taste from their own spoon, a gesture meant to be friendly, a silent acknowledgement of her talent. She shook her head gently, declining without a word, letting the beans simmer, letting the crowd devour them, and the whispers grew louder. Does she ever taste it? By midday, the sun had climbed high, beating down mercilessly on the tin roofs of nearby shops, glinting against the shiny metal bowls, reflecting off the sweat on her brow. She moved like a phantom through the growing crowd, ladling beans with a rhythm so precise it seemed almost ritualistic. People jostled for position, trading comments about the flavor, comparing notes about the texture, the seasoning, the perfect balance of smokiness and softness, as if discussing a meal from a five-star restaurant rather than a simple roadside stall. Mothers tugged at their children's sleeves, trying to convince them to wait patiently, while elderly men nodded approvingly at each ladle served. Money clinked into her small, worn leather bag with each transaction, but she barely looked at it, her attention entirely on the pot, on the beans, on the careful serving. And yet, even as the world praised her, as the air filled with appreciation, satisfaction, and hunger, she remained untouched by it all. Not once did she bring a spoon to her lips. Not once did she allow herself the taste of the food that had become her reputation, her livelihood, her strange kind of power. People noticed, of course. Children whispered, "Why doesn't she eat it?" Adults asked politely, teasing, laughing, trying to coax a smile or a small confession from her lips, but she responded only with gentle shakes of her head, soft hums, or fleeting smiles that never reached her eyes. Her silence became part of the story, part of the allure. People speculated endlessly, weaving stories around her restraint, imagining mysterious reasons, sacred traditions, curses, or secret knowledge that elevated her beyond ordinary understanding. Every day, as she served the line that never seemed to end, she felt the familiar weight pressing on her chest, the pressure of unseen forces and promises made long ago. She had begun this life desperate, barely surviving, with nothing but hunger chasing her. and now she wielded a power no one fully understood. The beans were hers to prepare, hers to serve, hers to sell, but not hers to taste. And as midday faded into afternoon, as the shadows grew longer, the crowd thinning only slightly, she packed her cart with the same care, lifted the pot, and walked away without a single bite, leaving behind a trail of lingering aroma and a town forever craving something they could never fully understand. Before the first pot of beans ever steamed across the streets, she had known only hunger, uncertainty, and the sharp sting of the city's indifference. Her small, rented room reeked of damp wood and mold, a forgotten corner in a building that had seen better days, its walls cracked, ceiling stained by years of leaking rain, and a window that let in only slivers of light. Each morning, she woke to the sound of distant traffic, the horn of a truck echoing through narrow alleys, and the cries of street children chasing emptiness for scraps. Money had always been a stranger, teasing her with its absence, arriving only in whispers of promises never kept in the form of jobs that demanded too much and paid too little. The day had begun like any other, but the memory of her father's voice, sharp and disappointed, haunted her. A woman without means is like a fire without flame. She will burn nothing and be burned herself. That voice, though long gone, shaped every move she made, driving her to streets where survival became her first language and courage her constant companion. Debt had accumulated silently, a weight pressing against her shoulders like a relentless hand. Landlords called twice a week, voices sharp, urgent, demanding payment she could not produce. Bills for water, electricity, and rent were a daily ritual of anxiety, her palms sweaty and heart racing each time she thought about the next day's obligations. Sometimes she scavenged for coins under benches or begged politely from neighbors, offering smiles in exchange for temporary relief. Other times she simply went hungry, letting her stomach shrink so that the emptiness would feel less unbearable, conditioning herself for the long days ahead. Family ties, which might have offered some shelter or reprieve, had dissolved long ago into bitter memories and obligations she could never fulfill. Every relationship she had once depended upon fractured under the pressure of survival, leaving her to navigate the world alone, a lone figure walking the tightrope between existence and collapse. The city never paused, never waited. People brushed past her on crowded sidewalks, oblivious to her presence, their eyes fixed forward, blind to the desperation that shadowed her every step. It was in the suffocating grip of such hopelessness that she discovered cooking as a last resort, not a passion, not a calling, but a tool to reclaim the fragments of life slipping through her fingers. The first pot of beans she prepared was humble, almost pitiful. A small blackened pan scraped from a secondhand market, beans soaking unevenly, seasoning crude, but it carried potential. That first taste, eaten in secret after hours of preparation, revealed an unexpected truth. She had a knack, an instinctive ability to balance flavor, texture, and aroma in ways she had never imagined. Yet, even as the smell filled the room, promising warmth and satisfaction, she did not allow herself to savor it. Hunger gnawed at her, but something deeper warned against indulgence, a shadow of fear rooted in promises she had made silently to herself, or perhaps to forces she did not yet understand. Every spoonful prepared, every aroma that rose from the pot, felt like a small rebellion against fate, a defiance of the circumstances that had left her destitute and invisible. And when the first customer appeared, hesitant, almost timid, offering a coin and a curious glance, she realized that what began as survival might transform into opportunity, a path out of the relentless despair that had dominated her existence for so long. Money trickled in slowly at first, enough to cover bread for a single day or a candle for her room, but it carried with it something heavier: responsibility, expectation, and fear. She calculated each ingredient, each measure, not only for flavor but for longevity, ensuring the beans would appeal, that no one would leave dissatisfied, that the fragile thread of her emerging livelihood would not snap. People began to notice, murmuring in admiration, sharing stories of a woman whose beans tasted like warmth, comfort, and home despite her modest setting. But she remained cautious, eyes darting toward strangers, ears attuned to conversations, heart aware that luck could be stolen as quickly as it arrived. She avoided tasting the beans herself, not from pride, not from disdain, but because she feared the consequences of indulgence, the silent contract she had entered with survival. That restraint became both shield and secret, an invisible armor against the whims of fate, ensuring that while the world praised her culinary gift, she remained tethered to the unspoken promise that governed her life. Hunger persisted, exhaustion deepened, and yet, as money accumulated in a worn leather pouch, hope whispered that perhaps she could endure, perhaps she could escape the suffocating weight of her past, if only she continued to obey the rules she had never fully articulated aloud, the rules that ensured her skill remained untouched and her story, for now, continued to unfold. By the time her stall had become a fixture in the bustling street, the whispers had started to grow louder, weaving themselves into the fabric of the town like an invisible thread that no one could ignore. People lingered longer, eyes flicking toward her with curiosity masked as casual observation, trying to discern why the woman whose beans had earned near mythical status never allowed herself even a single taste. She moved among her customers with calm efficiency, ladle in hand, voice soft but steady, responding to requests with polite nods, smiles that never quite reached her eyes, and gestures that conveyed more than words could. Each serving was measured with meticulous care, every portion uniform in size, every bowl steaming and inviting, but the most obvious truth remained. She herself remained untouched by the very food that had become the obsession of an entire neighborhood. The pots hissed as they released clouds of fragrance into the air, the beans glistening with oils and seasoning, creating an almost hypnotic spectacle that drew people closer, as if each spoonful were a spell designed to bind them to her craft. Children pressed closer to the counter, noses twitching at the aroma, adults leaned over in anticipation, and drivers parked along the roadside abandoned their routines, entranced by the sensory lure, while she remained apart, a silent figure at the center of a storm of appetite, her gaze focused, distant, and unreadable, guarding a secret she had sworn never to reveal. Even her employees, the few who had been allowed to assist, sensed the strangeness. They watched her fold beans with deliberate rhythm, the slight tilt of her head as she sniffed the steam rising, the flicker of unease in her eyes when someone offered a taste or attempted a compliment. Questions were always met with deflections, evasions, or polite smiles. "I've eaten enough already," she would murmur, or "It tastes different to me," shrugging off inquiries as though they were trivial. Yet behind the calm exterior, subtle tremors betrayed her, a quick tightening of the jaw, the faint shifting of weight from one foot to the other, hands pressed just a fraction harder on the ladle than necessary. Those who knew her best, the few who had glimpsed her private moments before sunrise, noticed the ritualistic care she took with each pot, almost as if the beans carried not just flavor, but power, responsibility, and an invisible debt that only she could perceive. Every stir, every ladle, every careful spooning into metal bowls became a delicate choreography, executed flawlessly, while her own restraint became a spectacle that was neither explained nor acknowledged, the absence of indulgence speaking louder than any words ever could. Rumors grew faster than her line of customers, whispers blending into tales told in hushed tones along crowded buses, over steaming plates of takeaway food, and at busy intersections where vendors peddled bread, tea, or fried plantain. Does she never eat? One would ask, leaning toward another, voice lowered as if fear of a curse might make the words audible to the wrong ears. Others shrugged, nodded knowingly, citing traditions of old, imagining hidden spells, sacrifices, or unspoken agreements with forces that lurked beyond mortal understanding. Some believed she had been touched by spirits. Others thought her self-denial was a kind of test for those who purchased the beans, a lesson in patience and appreciation. The most daring attempted to offer her a taste from their own bowls, a gesture of gratitude or playful curiosity, only to see her shake her head, smile faintly, and return to her precise ladling without a word, leaving a lingering aura of wonder and unease. The contrast between the warmth of her beans and the cool detachment of the woman serving them created a tension so palpable that customers felt drawn into it, sensing that the very act of eating carried weight beyond flavor, as if each bite tethered them not just to her food, but to a secret too dangerous to expose. Among the regulars, one individual emerged as more persistent than the rest, a young man whose fascination shifted from admiration to obsession. He watched how she measured each serving with almost obsessive care, noting the subtle micro-movements, the way her fingers trembled when she cleaned the edges of the pot, the slight recoil when someone reached out to help, the brief pause as she sniffed the beans, inhaling deeply without tasting, as if drawing sustenance from the aroma alone. He questioned friends, pressed them for stories, pieced together fragments of what others had noticed but never fully understood, and slowly realized that this was no ordinary vendor. There was restraint here that bordered on ritual, discipline that hinted at consequence, a silent promise or warning woven into her behavior that no outsider could comprehend. Each day, he lingered, watching not for the beans themselves, but for the moment when the spell might break, when her restraint might falter, when curiosity or desperation might force her hand. The tension built invisibly, a thread stretched taut over a pit of unseen danger, leaving the audience to wonder, as he did, what lay behind the eyes that never sought the taste that everyone craved. Every gesture, every hesitation, every silent refusal became part of a story that no one could tell aloud, yet everyone felt, creating a magnetic pull that made her life, her habits, and the mysterious beans themselves impossible to ignore. No one could have guessed the true reason she never tasted the beans until that day. The day the story began to bleed beyond whispers into the streets themselves, carried by the wary eyes of those who had glimpsed the edges of a secret too heavy for ordinary understanding. Years before the first pot of steaming beans had ever met a hungry hand, she had been a woman teetering on the edge of collapse, her life a narrow corridor of desperation where every decision mattered, every coin counted, and every missed opportunity threatened annihilation. There was a time when she had walked through crowded marketplaces, begging silently for scraps, offering labor she could not sustain, borrowing small sums she could not repay, and looking into the eyes of strangers who would grant her nothing beyond a cold nod or a dismissive glance. Hunger was not a threat. It was a constant companion, gnawing at bone and muscle alike, a reminder that she existed only at the mercy of forces beyond her control. It was in the suffocating embrace of such hopelessness, at the lowest point of her existence, that she had stumbled upon the figure who would alter the course of her life forever. A figure both strange and silent, a presence that spoke without words and demanded only recognition of need. This person had offered her something that seemed impossible. Beans that would never fail, that would always sell, that would bring not just sustenance, but currency, enough to survive and then thrive, enough to pull herself from the edge of despair and into a life with choices, however limited. But the offer came with an unspoken weight, a covenant that bore no margin for error, a contract that demanded obedience to rules invisible to the casual observer. You may feed the world, the figure had said, voice low and deliberate, but you must never taste what is yours to serve. To take for yourself what was meant for others will summon consequences beyond human reckoning. At the time, the words had sounded like superstition, a fairy tale to frighten the weak and impressionable. Hunger, however, is a force that sharpens perception, and she understood immediately that to refuse this covenant was to choose death by starvation, exposure, or despair. She agreed, her signature silent, her lips pressed tight, her mind calculating the risk and reward as any survivor does when offered a hand that could lift them from the abyss. That night, she left with a small bundle of beans, nothing remarkable in appearance, yet every kernel contained the promise of life and the burden of obedience, a duality she would carry in every stir, every ladle, every carefully measured serving she would ever prepare. The conditions were simple but absolute. She must prepare and serve the beans to anyone who came, without interruption, without exception, and under no circumstances consume even a single spoonful herself. Any deviation, any indulgence, any act of tasting would activate the clause no mortal wish to test, an unseen mechanism of punishment that would return to her the life she borrowed, raw and untamed. It was not simply that the beans would fail. It was that the consequence would manifest physically, violently, and irrevocably. There would be no warning, no gradual decay, no second chance. The life force infused within the beans, the unseen energy that sustained their allure, was tethered directly to her abstinence. One bite, one moment of weakness, and the covenant would demand repayment in a manner both horrifying and final, an outward manifestation of the secret she bore alone. Over time, the act of serving without tasting became instinct, a ritual performed at dawn while the streets slept, while the city's chaos had yet to awaken, while the line of hungry mouths awaited her precise, deliberate, unwavering attention. Every ladle lifted, every pot stirred, every bowl served reinforced the covenant, each action a thread weaving the fragile tapestry that separated survival from catastrophe, wealth from devastation, life from a fate she refused even to imagine. Even as the street now thrummed with the hum of morning traffic, the chatter of customers, and the clatter of coins exchanging hands, the memory of that covenant clung to her like a shadow no sunlight could dissipate. The young man who had become her silent observer noticed nuances others ignored. The way her fingers hovered over the edge of the pot, the way her eyes darted toward the steam rather than the bowl, the fraction of a second where hesitation curved her spine before she ladled the beans, a gesture that looked ordinary but carried the weight of invisible restraint. He could see the fear buried beneath the calm, the awareness that each portion given, each satisfied smile, each coin in her worn leather bag was tied to an unspoken rule that demanded obedience beyond desire. It was no longer mere curiosity that drew him near. It became obsession, the need to understand why a woman could command the taste, the loyalty, the devotion of so many, yet deny herself the simplest pleasure, the smallest indulgence. Every stir, every ladle, every invisible breath she drew over the simmering beans was a silent reminder that what appeared ordinary to the world carried a cost she alone bore. The ritual was invisible, the promise eternal, and the story of her restraint had begun to weave itself into the collective consciousness of the street, a legend in the making, waiting only for the day the covenant would be tested and the secret long hidden would erupt into reality. The morning began like any other, sunlight cutting through the narrow streets and bouncing off the corrugated roofs, but attention lingered that no amount of bustling traffic or cheerful chatter could dispel. She arranged her beans with meticulous care, the familiar rhythm of ladling, stirring, and serving now tinged with unease. The line of customers formed, faces expectant, stomachs growling, yet she sensed something unusual, a quiet ripple in the air that set her nerves on edge. It started with whispers among the early arrivals, a few cautious glances in her direction, Murmurs about authorities, inspections, and questions about her unusual practice of never tasting her own beans. By mid-morning, those murmurs had solidified into reality. Two figures appeared at the edge of the crowd, dressed in crisp uniforms that bore the insignia of Nafdak. Their presence carried authority, a quiet command that made heads turn and conversations die down instantly. Eyes followed them as they approached her stall, calm but deliberate, the faint clink of their badges against their belts echoing across the street. A ripple of curiosity passed through the crowd, murmurs turning into anxious speculation. What do they want? The inspector's arrival brought a formal weight to the moment, one that made every passerby pause as if holding their collective breath. She felt her pulse accelerate, a tremor threading through her hands even as she maintained the illusion of composure. The taller officer stepped forward, a clipboard in hand, voice smooth but firm. "Madam, for the sake of public confidence, you must demonstrate that the food you serve is safe by tasting it yourself." His tone left no room for debate, and the words struck her like a thunderclap in a quiet room. Panic rose swiftly, hot and unrelenting, a coil tightening in her chest as she understood that this was the day she had feared, the day the covenant she had carried for years demanded reckoning. Her mind raced, weighing options, plotting escape, seeking a loophole, yet she knew with a cold certainty that none existed. To refuse could bring suspicion, legal consequences, or worse, and yet to comply meant risking the unimaginable, the very punishment that had haunted her since the beans had first crossed her path. Her heart hammered with urgency as the crowd began to sense her distress, their whispers growing louder, eyes scanning the subtle changes in her posture, the way her fingers clenched slightly around the ladle, the way a bead of sweat traced a line down her temple. She tried to move, to step back, to retreat behind the cart that had been her refuge for so long. But the inspectors advanced steadily, not with hostility, but with a quiet insistence that left no alternative. One of them gently lifted a spoon, an unspoken cue that she should comply, while the other watched her every reaction with unwavering attention. The crowd shifted, forming a perimeter, sensing the weight of what was about to unfold without fully understanding it. The young man who had been her silent observer for weeks now felt a thrill of dread ripple through his chest. He had watched her restraint for so long, traced every hesitation, and now the ritual was about to collide with reality. She trembled, knees weak, breath shallow, eyes darting between the steaming pot, the crowd, and the officers, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Her fingers brushed the spoon, a mere touch, and a shiver ran through her body as though the beans themselves recoiled at the contact. A silent warning that the covenant would not be bent, that the invisible tether between her and the life force she had borrowed was now taut and unforgiving. Then she did the unthinkable. The spoon lifted to her lips, the warm aroma brushing her senses, and the world seemed to contract, the bustling street fading to nothing as the gravity of the moment settled in. She swallowed a single deliberate motion, and the reaction was instantaneous. Pain twisted through her limbs, a convulsion that racked her spine, forcing her to collapse onto the cracked pavement, limbs flailing as if seized by forces unseen. Her mouth opened, and a sound ripped from her throat, a scream, a gurgle, a gasp that mingled with horror and disbelief, as from within her, the life force she had long borrowed manifested in its most terrifying form. A serpent, slick and glistening, slithered forth, living and writhing, wriggling in ways that defied human comprehension. The crowd recoiled, some stumbling backward, others frozen, mouths agape, unable to tear their eyes from the spectacle. The inspector stepped aside, professionalism momentarily shattered by the raw, visceral horror before them. Her body twisted violently, limbs contorting as though the world itself were bending around her, and the finality of the covenant became undeniable. Seconds stretched into eternity as the snake writhed, her life force returning, her fate sealed, leaving behind a silence so profound that even the city's usual chaos seemed muted, absorbed into the shock of what had just occurred. She collapsed entirely, motionless, the air thick with the coppery scent of fear, the lingering aroma of beans, and the unshakable presence of a secret that had finally been revealed in the most harrowing, irreversible way. The crowd remained frozen long after the convulsions had ceased, their eyes fixed on the still form of the woman whose beans had once been the heartbeat of the street. Silence hung over the alley like a heavy curtain, broken only by the distant echo of a bus horn or the faint murmur of someone too stunned to speak. Coins had fallen from trembling hands, bowls had been abandoned mid-portion, and the lingering scent of cooked beans, once inviting, now clung to the air like a ghost, rich and terrifying. Some of the onlookers, paralyzed by disbelief, could not comprehend what had unfolded, their minds cycling through denial, horror, and the inevitable recognition that the life they had admired had been tethered to forces beyond ordinary comprehension. The snake, slick and shining, had disappeared as suddenly as it had emerged, leaving no trace beyond the memory etched into every nerve of the witnesses. People shuffled back slowly, their whispers tentative, almost reverent, attempting to make sense of an event that defied logic, a spectacle that would haunt them long after they had returned to homes, buses, and their routine lives. Mothers clutched children to their sides, muttering prayers beneath their breath. Men exchanged glances laden with fear. Even the street vendors, who had long grown accustomed to chaos and unpredictability, found themselves unable to speak. The beans, once a symbol of comfort and livelihood, now carried a dark weight, their power undeniable, their allure forever tarnished by the consequences that had finally surfaced in full and terrifying clarity. Naftak officials, previously composed and methodical, remained in stunned silence, realizing the gravity of the incident. Their instructions had been procedural, their intent regulatory, yet the manifestation of the covenant had exceeded any scenario they could have imagined. They documented the event with trembling hands, noting observations with meticulous care, aware that what had occurred was more than a violation of food safety protocols. It was a convergence of human desperation, hidden promises, and forces that could not be quantified. The official report, later circulated in hushed tones, detailed the precision of her cooking, the obsessive care with which she had handled each pot, and the moment of violation that triggered the uncontrollable life-consuming consequence. Witnesses would later recount in whispered recollections that her calm demeanor, the very feature that had once concealed fear, had been shattered instantly, replaced with the raw, human terror of someone bound to a pact whose terms were absolute and unyielding. Every movement, every hesitation, every tremor was recorded in memory as a warning. Some hunger, some desire, carries a price beyond the reckoning of ordinary understanding, and the beans, once a symbol of sustenance and survival, had become a testament to that price. In the days that followed, the street where her cart had stood remained eerily silent. Regular customers hesitated to approach, glancing over shoulders, fearing the invisible presence that lingered after her absence. The aroma of freshly cooked beans no longer beckoned. The laughter and chatter of satisfied diners had vanished, replaced by a careful quiet and almost ritualistic avoidance of the space she had occupied. Stories spread rapidly, each retelling amplifying the horror and moral alike, with neighbors recounting the sight of her body, the twisting that preceded her death, and the snake that had emerged as if it carried the essence of every portion she had ever ladled. Some claimed that even the wind seemed to carry a warning, stirring leaves and debris around the spot she had collapsed, whispering caution to anyone who approached with curiosity or disregard. Children who once played near her stall avoided the area entirely, and adults muttered prayers before continuing along familiar paths. The beans, magical and delicious in memory, became a cautionary tale, an unspoken lesson that permeated the neighborhood, that the allure of sustenance, the desire for abundance, carries consequences when bound by promises or covenants that transcend human understanding. The memory of her eyes, once calm and unreadable, now haunted those who had witnessed the final act, a reminder that life can be sustained, but only if its rules are obeyed without indulgence. And so the legend grew. The story of the woman in her 30s, desperate yet disciplined, who had commanded the taste and loyalty of an entire street without ever tasting her own creation, became woven into the folklore of the city. It was told on buses, in marketplaces, across alleys where vendors carried out their trade, and in homes where children listened wide-eyed to tales of the extraordinary and the dangerous. Her beans were remembered, not just for their flavor, but for the price paid, for the life tethered to their existence, and for the silent promise that had governed every stir, every ladle, every careful measure. The moral was unmistakable. Some hunger cannot be satisfied without sacrifice. Some gifts carry obligations that cannot be ignored. And some secrets, no matter how hidden, demand reckoning in ways that defy human comprehension. In the end, she became more than a vendor. She became a story, a caution, a living legend etched into the memories of those who had witnessed her brilliance and her demise. And as the city moved on, carrying the ordinary weight of daily life, the memory of the beans lingered, an invisible pulse in the streets, a silent warning to those who might ever tempt fate, reminding all who heard the tale that some indulgences are never meant to be, and some rewards, no matter how tempting, demand a cost no human can bear.
To my amazing Afritales family, thank you from the depths of my heart for every view, every comment, every share, and every moment you spend on this channel. I promise to keep bringing you stories that move your soul and stay with you long after the video ends.